How are you? Today I'm going to talk about something other than the war. It's a different kind of fight that a lot of people have to go through. And it's one that happens really all over the world. But it happens the most in civilized society and regulated society, in developed nations where you have extremely high amounts of rules and regulations. And what I'm talking about is bureaucracy, and the fact that bureaucracy kills. What do I mean by that? I think anybody who studied history will know that it is in fact a truism that when you add up the reasons why people suffer in life and eventually die, one of the very big reasons is actually toxic and lethal bureaucracy. And it actually causes real harm, physically and mentally and emotionally, as well as financially. It drains people's time, causes them stress. It can actually cause grave injury, like physical injury, because the paperwork causes so much stress. The delays, all the excuses that institutions are allowed to use against the little guy create so much stress on the person's mind, on their emotions, and on their body that they literally get injured from various reasons. Because that kind of stress can cause damage to your body, even if it's, they're not maybe hitting you physically, but the emotional and psychological damage are impacting you physically. And I mean that 100%. So, what is this about? Talking about everything from mundane, routine things that people experience, from going to, pay their normal bills, their banking, manage their banking, whatever it is, paying their whatever they owe a government or a utility company or anything like that. All those kind of things. Property taxes and anything else. Fees on withdrawing funds from a stock market. So if you have, it doesn't, you can have $1 million worth of stock in your stock market account, and if you want to withdraw it to your account, you might have to pay a high fee to withdraw that money. And if you don't have that money available to pay for your own money to arrive to you, they don't have to give you your own money for a stock withdrawal if you don't actually have that money in your account. So if you have to pay like $10,000 or $20,000 to withdraw your $1 million, which is, definitely something you might have to do, you don't get to get your $1 million until you pay that until you pay that $10,000 or $20,000 first. And you'll think to yourself, well, wait, can't they just deduct that from your portfolio amount? In some cases they can, in some cases they won't. It's not that they can't, it's that they won't. Because they want to make your life inconvenient. And they want you to hold, let's say you're trying to sell when you think the price is high. So you make a good profit before the price falls again. Well, they don't want you to sell when it's high, do they? If they're holding your money. They want you to sell when it's low. Right? So that you've lost money. Because that's how they make their money. And you think to yourself, wait a minute, don't they get more money for the withdrawal transaction if you sell when the price is high? Yes, but it depends on the broker and their position. And if the broker and their position is to acquire as much of that same stock as you're holding, then they want you to sell it when it's low so they can buy it off you and ride out the next wave. And then they can sell it when it's high. So It's extremely unethical, and it is an example of how essentially death by 1,000 cuts works. And this happens all the time to all kinds of good people who have no clue about using the loopholes to their advantage. Why this happens is because lawyers, right? You can love them or hate them. Corporate lawyers and lobbyists are the ones who make the rules with government. Because lobbyists inform government. Government makes their informed decisions based on the information they've been given. Usually their assistants are the ones who actually make those decisions, because their assistants are the ones actually doing the research and the writing of the legislation. So what you end up having is sausage made by people who don't actually have the power to legislate, who work for the people who have the power to legislate, who they themselves don't know anything or know very little about the actual legislation that they're putting their name on. They don't know anything about the actual industry or industries that are being impacted and what their interests are. And they certainly don't care about the little guy who's going to foot the, as is always the case, for the big guys. Right? It's always the case that the little guy is paying the bill for the big guy when it comes to legislation and bureaucracy. How they do that is they take the total cost and they say, well, rather than divide this up by the top 10,000 people in the country who have all the money, or 100,000 people, or 1 million people, we're going to divide it up by 300 million people, or whatever the number of people is in the country. And therefore, all the little guys are paying much smaller amounts, yes, but proportional to their overall individual wealth, the 300 million people are paying much higher fees, percentage-wise, than the 10,000 wealthiest, or the 100,000 wealthiest, or the million wealthiest. You can't even compare it. For example, if the average person is asked to pay a $10,000 fee right now in the United States, they can't do it. Right? They're $500 away from being bankrupt. Right? If you ask a billionaire to pay $10,000, that's nothing for them. Right? So the percentage of the net wealth of the average American, which isn't $10,000 spare cash in their account, versus the average billionaire, who has billions in their account, right? The percentage comparison is 100% to negligible percent, right? So you can't really compare that. But that's exactly how they do that. And they may not, obviously, not charge fees of $10,000 to the average person for regular small things that they do. And that's the death by 1,000 cuts. $1 here, $5 there, $30 there, $100 there, $1,000 there, maybe sometimes. And then yes, when you want to pull out money from an account, you may be charged a percent or two of that transaction. And if you're fortunate enough to have invested in something that made you $1 million or whatever, you might have to pay $10,000, $20,000, maybe more. That's on your broker. And so it is disgusting and ironic. In fact, it's usually, by the way, a lot more than 1 or 2%. But that's just an example of how bureaucracy literally kills people. It doesn't just prevent them from getting wealthy. It does that too, obviously. Because if you can't take out $2 million, then you can't afford to get your wealth. Therefore, you can't afford to enter the class of people who have $1 million or more, which these days doesn't make you wealthy, but certainly puts you in a higher percentage financial bracket than 99% of the people who do not have $1 million or more. Which again, these days, is probably worth about what like 100 grand was back in the 80s. Right? When you consider the dollar has decreased in value more than 99% since its introduction in 1913. I mean, the fiat dollar, which was still back then tied to gold, but then quickly went off the gold standard, and completely went off the gold standard by the time Nixon, depegged the dollar from gold completely, even paper gold, right? Paper notes that say they're worth gold. So for the past 50 years, there's been zero correlation between the gold and the dollar, right? In terms of the pegging, there's mathematical correlation on the volatility, entropy, probability, statistics, of course, all that. But there's no direct peg between even paper gold, let alone real gold, and the dollar. So the dollar is just pure fiat since then, and the government's just been printing it out like a non-stop stream. And half of all the debt, half of all the dollars that were ever printed were printed between 2016 and 2020 under the previous U.S. administration. And in fact, most of it was printed as a result of COVID and the whole what the government planned, and tried to do to help businesses, blah, 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 the PPP and all that stuff. And since then, a ridiculously huge amount has also been printed. So at this point, most of the debt that the U.S. has ever acquired, and since its independence in 1776, right, most of it has been acquired since 2016, so in the last 7 years, under the previous administration and this current one, right? And, I don't care which side you're on, recognize that they both created massive debts on top of the already massive debts that existed. They just pushed it over the edge one notch further to one level higher. Now, are those debts sustainable for the U.S. government? For the time being, yes. Because believe it or not, even though people will tell you, oh, there's only a certain number of trillions of dollars on the market, $75 trillion in the world, or $100 trillion, or whatever they tell you, $200 trillion. It's actually much more than that. It's around $4 quadrillion worth of assets on the market in the world. Everything from houses to cars to jewelry to consumer electronics to, trees to whatever it is people buy, toys, I don't care what, utility devices, appliances, anything, right? Sports equipment, you name it. There's something like $4 quadrillion of assets and debts, right? And so the value of the market of the world is something like $4 quadrillion at the current price of the dollar. And where do you get that money from? You can look it up on various charts and understand how the money flows are. And you'll see that there's actually quadrillions of dollars, not just trillions. So when you have even a 20 or 30 or even $100 billion or trillion dollar debt, it sounds insane, $100 trillion debt. Well, we're not even close to that yet in the U.S. But let's say there was $100 trillion of debt in the U.S. $100 trillion is not even, 10% of the overall global market assets. Why does that matter? Because most of the global market assets for the past 50 years have been pegged to the U.S. dollar. What does that mean? That means that assets in Europe, assets in Asia, assets in Africa, assets in South America, even assets in places like Russia, right, are pegged to the U.S. dollar. Not just because of oil, but because their fiat currency has been or is tied to the dollar. What does that mean? It means that no matter how crazy high the U.S. debt goes, there are people who borrow debt from the U.S. And in so doing, they are engaging in ballooning the U.S. debt. So, when people balloon the debt by borrowing dollars or buying dollars, either way, they're creating debt. Right? Then what you have is countries around the world who owe the U.S. debt, dollars. Now, many countries also buy dollars, so they hold dollars, which means that whatever debt is paid back will come back to them in value. Right? But what it means is that no matter how much debt the U.S. has, other countries, first of all, also own debt and owe debt to each other as well as to the U.S. And it also means that the U.S. can call its roosters home whenever it so chooses. They can say, hey, you know what, we're calling in that debt, we need to pay back. And those countries either have to pay back the debt or find some other way to make the debt be wiped off the books. And that can be done in a number of ways. It can be done by both countries canceling the debt they owe each other, which is effectively the same thing as paying it. It can be done by, the ugly war machine, which is the very common tool that is used, where one nation takes the resources of another in order to cancel a debt or to settle it. And it can be done by ignoring it and pretending it doesn't exist. And while you think that's a laughable idea, it has happened. And it doesn't lead to good results. Because in the end, as long as you ignore it, technically it's just going to fester and get worse. Even if you don't add and accrue interest, etc., as long as the dollars or the other currencies keep inflating, then the amount of the debt is going to keep growing over time. And even if you keep it flat, over time, it's going to fester and become a problem and either have to be resolved politically or militarily or in some other way. And usually, it's not good for at least one, if not both parties involved. So, this all comes back to the bureaucracy that kills. As long as the governments that run the world are allowed to maintain rules and regulations outside of the law, extrajudicially, under special rules and regulations, like regulatory arms of the government, that aren't technically legislated into existence, or their regulatory bodies may be legislated into existence, but the rules and regulations that they apply are not laws. They are rules and regulations, and they are given the power of enforcement by law, even though they don't actually pass laws. They pass rules and regulations that people have to adhere to. And as long as they're allowed to favor big organizations against individual citizens, you're never going to have a just world. You're never going to have a world in which the individual is actually free. You're never going to have a world in which the power of the individual matches the power of the large organization, even though it's entirely possible for that to exist. It's a matter of choosing to enable that power. And the reason that governments don't choose to enable that power is very simple. They don't want to have many people have that power. They want as few people as possible to have that power because it's easier to work with and or control as few people as possible and as few organizations as possible, especially if those organizations have deep pockets. Right? Then it's very easy to control them. Because if they step out of line, you can always threaten them with rules and regulations. And it's a lot easier to do to one very large organization that has thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of employees versus doing it to an individual who's just an individual. But if you have millions and millions of individuals who all demand their rights and are not held back by bureaucracy, then the large institutions and the regulatory bodies have zero control and zero power, and they're afraid of that more than anything. The beauty of it is, there is a solution to all this that individuals can take part in, and that they can actually make a difference. Make a difference.